Good morning. Thank you for joining me today. This morning we'll be in Leviticus chapter 13, verses 1 through 59. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. When someone has a swelling or a scab or a bright spot on the skin of his body that may become a diseased infection, he must be brought to Aaron, the priest, or one of his sons, the priests. The priest must then examine the infection on the skin of the body, and if the hair in the infection has turned white, and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of the body, then it is a diseased infection. So when the priest examines it, he must pronounce the person unclean. If it is a white, bright spot on the skin of his body, but it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair has not turned white, then the priest is to quarantine the person with the infection for 7 days. The priest must then examine it on the 7th day, and if, as far as he can see, the infection has stayed the same and has not spread on the skin, then the priest is to quarantine the person for another 7 days. The priest must then examine it again on the 7th day, and if the infection has faded and has not spread on the skin, then the priest is to pronounce the person clean. It is a scab, so he must wash his clothes and be clean. If, however, the scab is spreading further on the skin after he has shown himself to the priest for his purification, then he must show himself to the priest a second time. The priest must then examine it, and if the scab has spread on the skin, then the priest is to pronounce the person unclean. It is a disease. When someone has a diseased infection, he must be brought to the priest. The priest will then examine it, and if a white swelling is on the skin, it has turned the hair white, and there is raw flesh in the swelling. It is a chronic disease on the skin of his body, so the priest is to pronounce him unclean. The priest must not merely quarantine him, for he is unclean. If, however, the disease breaks out on the skin, so that the disease covers all the skin of the person with the infection from his head to his feet, as far as the priest can see, the priest must then examine it, and if the disease covers his whole body, he is to pronounce the person with the infection clean. He has turned all white, so he is clean. But whenever raw flesh appears in it, he will be unclean. So the priest is to examine the raw flesh and pronounce him unclean. It is diseased. If, however, the raw flesh once again turns white, then he must come to the priest. The priest will then examine it, and if the infection has turned white, the priest is to pronounce the person with the infection clean. He is clean. When somebody's body has a boil on its skin and it heals, and in the place of the boil there is a white swelling or a reddish-white bright spot, he must show himself to the priest. The priest will then examine it, and if it appears to be deeper than the skin, and its hair has turned white, then the priest is to pronounce the person unclean. It is a diseased infection that is broken out in the boil. If, however, the priest examines it, and there is no white hair in it, it is not deeper than the skin, and it has faded, then the priest is to quarantine him for 7 days. If it is spreading further on the skin, then the priest is to pronounce him unclean. It is an infection. But if the bright spot stays in its place and has not spread, it is the scar of the boil, so the priest is to pronounce him clean. When a body has a burn on its skin and the raw area of the burn becomes a reddish-white or white bright spot, the priest must examine it, and if the hair has turned white in the bright spot, and it appears to be deeper than the skin, it is a disease that has broken out in the burn. The priest is to pronounce the person unclean. It is a diseased infection. If, however, the priest examines it, and there is no white hair in the bright spot, it is not deeper than the skin, and it has faded, then the priest is to quarantine him for 7 days. The priest must then examine it on the 7th day, and if it is spreading further on the skin, then the priest is to pronounce him unclean. It is a diseased infection. But if the bright spot stays in its place, has not spread on the skin, and it has faded, then it is the swelling of the burn, so the priest is to pronounce him clean, because it is the scar of the burn. When a man or a woman has an infection on the head or in the beard, the priest is to examine the infection, and if it appears to be deeper than the skin, and the hair in it is reddish-yellow and thin, then the priest is to pronounce the person unclean. It is scall, a disease of the head or the beard. But if the priest examines the scall infection, and it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest is to quarantine the person with the scall infection for 7 days. The priest must then examine the infection on the seventh day, and if the skull has not spread, there is no reddish-yellow hair in it, and the skull does not appear to be deeper than the skin, then the individual is to shave himself, but he must not shave the area affected by the skull. And the priest is to quarantine the person with the skull for another 7 days. The priest must then examine the skull on the seventh day, and if the skull is not spread on the skin, and it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, then the priest is to pronounce him clean, so he is to wash his clothes and be clean. If, however, the skull spreads further on the skin after his purification, then the priest is to examine it, and if the skull has spread on the skin, the priest is not to search further for reddish-yellow hair. The person is unclean. If, as far as the priest can see, the skull has stayed the same and black hair has sprouted in it, the skull has been healed. The person is clean, so the priest is to pronounce him clean. When a man or a woman has bright spots on the skin of their body, the priest is to examine them, and if the bright spots on the skin of their body are faded white, it is a harmless rash that has broken out on the skin. The person is clean. When a man's head is bare, so that he is balding in back, he is clean. If his head is bare on the forehead, so that he is balding in front, he is clean. But if there is a reddish-white infection in the back or front bald area, it is a disease breaking out in his back or front bald area. The priest is to examine it, and if the swelling of the infection is reddish-white in the back or front bald area, like the appearance of a disease on the skin of the body, he is a diseased man. He is unclean. The priest must surely pronounce him unclean because of his infection on his head. As for the diseased person who has the infection, his clothes must be torn, the hair of his head must be unbound, he must cover his mustache, and he must call out, "Unclean, unclean." The whole time he has the infection, he will be continually unclean. He must live in isolation, and his place of residence must be outside the camp. When a garment has a diseased infection in it, whether a wool or linen garment, or in the warp or woof of the linen or the wool, or in leather or anything made of leather, if the infection in the garment or leather or warp or woof or any article of leather is yellowish-green or reddish, it is a diseased infection, and it must be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine and then quarantine the article with the infection for 7 days. He must examine the infection on the seventh day. If the infection has spread in the garment or in the warp or in the woof or in the leather, whatever the article into which the leather was made, the infection is a malignant disease. It is unclean. He must burn the garment or the warp or the woof, whether wool or linen or any article of leather, which has the infection in it, because it is a malignant disease. It must be burned up in the fire. But if the priest examines it and the infection has not spread in the garment or in the warp or in the woof or in any article of leather, the priest is to command that they wash whatever has the infection and quarantine it for another 7 days. The priest must then examine it after the infection has been washed out. And if the infection has not changed its appearance, even though the infection has not spread, it is unclean. You must burn it up in the fire. If it is a fungus, whether on the backside or front side of the article, but if the priest has examined it and the infection has faded after it has been washed, he is to tear it out of the garment or the leather or the warp or the woof. Then if it still appears again in the garment or the warp or the woof or in any article of leather, it is an outbreak. Whatever has the infection in it you must burn up in the fire. But the garment or the warp or the woof or any article of leather which you wash, and infection disappears from it, is to be washed a second time, and it will be clean. This is the law of the diseased infection in the garment of wool or linen, or the warp or woof, or any article of leather, for pronouncing it clean or unclean. Okay. So a bunch of laws concerning the identification of disease in a person and its bearing on whether a person is clean or unclean, which it seems that if a disease is identified, then it is then that person, mold and fungus being identified as well. Let's see here. When a man has on the skin of his body swelling, a scab, or a bright spot. This larger part of Leviticus, chapters 11 through 15, deals with laws of purity. In chapter 11, the laws of purity regarding the eating of animals were given. In chapter 12, the laws of purity regarding childbirth were given. In chapters 13 and 14, we have laws regarding growths and sores on the skin, walls, and fabrics. These were investigated for the presence of leprosy. It was the job of the priests of Israel to examine these potentially diseased areas in this sense. The priests served as public health officers and diagnosed the disease from these carefully defined criteria, not from intuition or guessing. The Hebrew priest physicians appear to have been the first in the ancient world to isolate persons suspected of infectious or contagious diseases. The law provided that there should be made careful distinction between actual leprosy and that which may appear to be leprosy. When the case was a clearly defined one, the method was drastic in the extreme. The methodology in the passage erred on the side of safety. If a person could not be pronounced clean with certainty, they were isolated until they could be pronounced clean. These judgments were based on sound medical diagnosis and concern. These judgments were made with a concern for the benefit of the afflicted person, but with an even greater concern for the health of the community from the outbreak of disease. These two principles are perpetual in their application. The state should ever have the right of inspection and examination. It should, however, use its right with the greatest care that no wrong be done to any individual. The type of infectious disease is not specified, but has often been associated with leprosy, since that noun sara'at was translated lepra in the Septuagint, and thus leprosy in earlier English translations. The Hebrew word does not exactly correspond to what we call leprosy today. It is rather a very general term that perhaps includes ringworm, psoriasis, leukoderma, as well as Hansen's disease, the modern medical terminology used to refer to what is commonly called leprosy today. Illnesses such as smallpox, measles, and scarlet fever might start out with a skin condition considered to be leprosy, and the person would be isolated for the necessary time until the condition cleared up. This quarantine helped prevent the spread of these kinds of diseases among the people of Israel. It is leprosy. Leprosy was dealt with so seriously because it was such a horrible disease. It was also a dramatic picture of sin and its spiritual operation in human beings. When leprosy first appears on its victim's skin, it begins as small red spots. Before too long, they get bigger, starting to turn white, having a shiny or scaly appearance. Soon the spots spread over the entire body, and the hair begins to fall out, first from the head, then even from the eyebrows. As things get worse, the fingernails and toenails become loose. They start to rot and eventually fall off. Then the joints of the fingers and toes begin to rot and start to fall off piece by piece. In the mouth, the gums start shrinking and are unable to hold teeth, so several teeth are often lost. Leprosy keeps eating away at the face until the nose is literally gone, and the palate and even eyes rot, and the victim wastes away until death. Yeah, certainly a picture of death in the body. Even until today, leprosy is so dire a disease that it completely baffles the skill of the physician. Much may be done to alleviate the distress which it causes, but there is no cure for it. In countries where sanitary laws obtain, it is almost eliminated, but that is done by removing causes, not by curing those suffering from it. That was from Morgan in 1926. Leprosy was indeed nothing short of a living death, a poisoning of the springs, a corrupting of all the humors of life, a dissolution little by little of the whole body, so that one limb after another actually decayed and fell away. These precautions were taken not merely for sanitary reasons or to guard against contagion, for it is not certain that leprosy was contagious, but in order that the people might be taught, through the parable of leprosy, what a fearful and loathsome thing sin is in the sight of God. Leprosy is like sin in many ways. There are some good reasons why many ancient rabbis considered a leper as someone already dead. Leprosy is like sin in that it begins as nothing, It is painless in its first stages. It grows slowly. It often remits for a while and then returns. It numbs the senses. One cannot feel in the afflicted area. It causes decay and deformity. It eventually gives a person a repulsive appearance. Every man by nature is like a leper, loathsome in his person, infected in all his actions, and all that he does. He is incapable of fellowship with God's people, and he is shut out utterly and entirely by his sin from the presence and acceptance of God. In light of these considerations, we remember that there came in the fullness of time one who could not only look at, but touch the leper, one who could cure. That is also the story of his dealing with sin. And the priest shall examine him. If a spot of raw flesh in the swelling, this showed this was not a superficial leprosy, but one of a deeper and more malignant nature, that had eaten into the very flesh, for which cause it is in the next verse called an old or inveterate or grown leprosy. The priest shall pronounce him unclean, and shall not isolate him. If a man or a woman was diagnosed with leprosy, they were no longer in isolation under the supervision of the priests. They lived on their own, excluded from the larger community of Israel. The only thing that the priest could do was to discover whether or not the disease was actually leprosy. If it were not, then there might be a period of separation, and presently a restoration to the community. If it were leprosy, nothing could be done other than to separate the sufferer completely from others. If the leprosy has covered all his body, he shall pronounce him clean. This is counterintuitive, but apparently, dealing with these ancient skin diseases, the stages of the disease gave hope for recovery. In addition, it proved a powerful spiritual picture, given the association of leprosy with humanity's sinful condition. Rocker sees that the key phrase in regard to the one whose leprosy has covered all his body is, it has turned all white. White skin indicated that a healing of the disease had taken place, since the white skin would be new skin that had grown over the raw flesh. As long as we palliate and excuse our sins, and dream that there is much in us which is noble and lovely, we are not fit subjects for God's saving grace. We must confess that from the crown of our head to the sole of our foot, we are full of need and sin. Then we are nearest Christ, and in a fit condition to be richly blessed, and made the channel of blessing to others. Interesting. The priests were also given the criteria to examine and judge the severity of skin problems associated with hairy parts of the body. It is a scaly leprosy. The word used here literally means a tearing off, something so annoying that the person who has it cannot keep his hands off it. He is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. The priest had the power to declare someone clean or unclean, but only on the basis of what God had specifically commanded. The true power was not in the priest's pronouncement, but in his application of what God's word instructed. If the priest had partially pronounced one clean who was not clean, his sentence had been null, and therefore it is a fond and dangerous conceit to think that the absolution given to any sinner by a priest will stand him in any stead if he does not truly repent. From Poole. His clothes shall be torn and his head bare. Once the diagnosis of leprosy was confirmed, everything changed for the leper. They lived in a perpetual state of mourning and in a perpetual state of public disgrace. he shall cry, unclean, unclean. Furthermore, they were commanded to live in a perpetual state of exclusion. He shall dwell alone. The leprous person is required to be as one that mourned for the dead, or for some great and public calamity. The emphasis is not on complete separation from all others, since people with this condition were permitted to live with each other, but they had to be away from the rest of the community. He is unclean, and he shall dwell alone. As strict as all this was, eventually many of the Jewish people went further in excluding lepers from society. In the days of Jesus, many Jews thought two things about a leper. You are the walking dead, and you deserve this because this is the punishment of God against you. Jewish custom said that you should not even greet a leper, and you had to stay 6 feet away from them. One rabbi bragged that he would not even buy an egg on a street where he saw a leper, and another boasted that he threw rocks at lepers to keep them from coming close. Some rabbis didn't even allow a leper to wash his face. But Jesus was different. He loved lepers. He touched them and healed them when they had no hope at all. Because of modern drugs and treatments, leprosy is almost unknown in the Western world. At one time, there were 2 leper colonies in the United States, but they have been closed. Yet worldwide, there are some 15 million lepers, almost all of them in developing nations. If a garment has a leprous plague on it, it was a broad definition and could include some forms of mold, mildew, and fungus. If the mold or mildew or fungus had not spread, the garment could be washed and isolated for another 7 days. If the mildew remained after the 7 days, the item was burned. If the mold or mildew or fungus had faded, the infected portion could be torn away. But if it appears again, the article needed to be burned. Interesting. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. Hope you have a great day. Bye.